Okay, G-Man, little introduction to biology. So, in the 1700s, there was a guy called Carl Linnaeus. I'll write his name down for you. Carl Linnaeus. He was a creationist that was obsessed with classifying or organising all of the plants and animals that he could see around him, so he could better understand God's creation. And he came up with this system. Basically, he looked at how similar things were, and he realised he could group them. And he realised that at the very top we had plants and animals. If you were alive and you weren't a plant, you were an animal, according to Carl Linnaeus. And he called these the kingdoms. But he wasn't satisfied there. He realised you had to be a little bit more specific than plant and animal. So he came up with a system at various levels that things could be classified or categorised into. And underneath kingdom was the phylum. Let's see if I can remember the order correctly. King penguins can often find great sausages. The class, the order, family, genus, and the species. Now, according to Carl Linnaeus, who was, he was really obsessed with naming all the plants and the animals, as Adam was. He realised that everything you looked at was a species, but in order to categorise them, group them together, you realise you could organise the species into the genus. And if you looked at the genus of things, you could organise the genus into things called families, and these had quite a lot of similarities. And then the families gave rise to the orders, and the orders the class, until eventually you got right up the top. So remember, you're either a plant or an animal, according to Carl Linnaeus, and it was just a naming, a categorisation system, and it was amazing. It was a brilliant start. However, Robert Hooke came along. Well, he was actually in the 1600s. He was an incredible scientist. And he used microscopes, and he came up with the idea of cell theory, and that was the idea that all plants and animals were made of cells. Cell theory, everything is made of cells. Yeah, so everything's made of cells. That's what Robert Hooke gave us. Now, looking at plants and animals through microscopes, they soon came to realise, as I'm sure you have if you've ever tried eating a mushroom, that not everything is a plant or an animal, even though everything is made of cells. And over time, the technologies got better. We got to know more by looking through the microscopes, and eventually we realised there were some things that didn't fit into any of these categories easy. We call those the protists. Again, not made of a cell. And there was one other thing that, because they were significantly smaller, and you've probably heard of it, they're bacteria. That's not to scale. And looking at these things, they realised all living things had a cell membrane. And the cell membrane controls things going in and out of the cell. They also realised that certain things like plants always had a cell wall. I'll put that on. Animals, on the other hand, they didn't have a cell wall. Fungi, mind you, I can find a different coloured pen. Fungi, they do have a different cell wall, but it's not made of cellulose like the plants. It's made of chitin, and they've got a cell wall. Protists, well, protists are a bit funny. Some do, some don't. So I've coloured that green because they're sort of, some are a bit planty, some are a bit like animals, and they tend to be single-celled. These ones down here tend to be single-celled. Bacteria are single-celled. Now the thing about bacteria is they too have a cell wall. So remember, we've just been looking at, we started with colonnaires who just looked at things, and then we actually looked at the cells of the things, and we realised that by looking at the cells of things there were certain differences that we could classify, and we realised the organelles, the cells had things inside them, and plants and animals and fungi, they all had these little dark spots that we call the nucleus. They all had a true nucleus. So we grouped all of these things together, and we called them U, which means true. Whoops. Karyote. These are eukaryotes, because they are all cells that have a true nucleus. Bacteria, on the other hand, is a prokaryote. Pro means before. It means the idea is that bacteria came around first, and then eventually we got the true nucleus forming. This is one piece of evidence for evolution, actually, that because I'll come to it in a bit. There is a piece of evidence that supports the theory of evolution. Evolution just being a group of ideas that fit together to explain, a group of explanations that fit together to explain the diversity of life and how things relate to each other. So anyway, so we've got plants now. Okay, so remember we looked at plants, and there were certain things that all plants and animals had in common, and one of those things is that plants and animals are all multicellular. Remember the eukaryotes, so they have a nucleus. They're multicellular. That means they're made of multiple cells, many cells. But within the cells, there are certain things that separate them out. Now, most of these things have remember, these are organelles. So I'm drawing on organelles, and you'll notice plants, animals and fungi and protists all have these little red dots that I've drawn on. And these, oops, let's carry on labelling in the same colour. These are mitochondria. These are the powerhouse of the cell. They're what helps the cell release the energy from its food. Now, plants are somewhat different in that they have chloroplasts. And chloroplasts take the energy from the sun and carbon and oxygen, and they turn that into food. And they're actually making their own food, and that's why they have the mitochondria in there, because it breaks down their own food. So they're making their own food, so at night time they actually eat the food they made in the day. In the day they're still eating the food, it's just that they can make food quicker than they eat it. Animals, on the other hand, and fungi both rely on other things being present, and that's what they actually eat them. Now, and so we go into the protists. Now, protists are a little bit unusual in that some, like I was saying, have the cell wall and some don't, and some actually have chloroplast-like things. There's some that are actually capable of making their own food. Some just go around eating. Now, we're still looking at things, and I said I'd come back to the scale. We've got all of these things here, which are the eukaryotes. They all have a nucleus. They all have mitochondria. They all have a cell membrane. However, fungi have a cell wall, which is made of one thing, and plants have a cell wall, which is made of something else. Plants and animals, remember, multicellular. Protists are all single-celled. The idea being that they started off with bacteria. We ended up with slightly more complicated single-celled creatures like protists. and these went on to form the multicelled creatures. Now, fungi are slightly unusual in that they can be both single-celled and multicellular. Bacteria we're only going to have as single-celled. Now, the thing about these being prokaryotes means they don't have a nucleus, but they do have DNA. They actually will also have little loops, or plasmids, little loops of DNA. These can change quite quickly and allow them to adapt to the environment. Now, I did mention earlier on that this formed part of the theory of evolution, and one of those things is, as I was mentioning, the scale. If we look at the scale of the organelles, the things inside the cell, they actually line up pretty much with the scale of a bacteria. And if you had a bigger picture of a cell like this and you looked at the organelles, say the nucleus, with its DNA on the inside, it actually has a double membrane. So remember, cells have a single membrane like that. Well, inside your cells, the organelles all have a double membrane, as if a small bacteria had been consumed within a larger bacteria. So you have the original membrane and then the membrane that consumed that original bacteria. And the same is true for, if we look at the chloroplasts, we're like that. We have this double membrane and inside we have all its components. And if we look at the mitochondria, we have its outside cell membrane like that, and on the inside we have this wrinkled surface, another cell membrane. Like I say, they're all, so these are the organelles, and they all have a double membrane. And this is the thing, these are just observations. This is just an observation of what we see in nature as Linnaeus first observed and sorted things into groups and classifications, and we carried on with that, and we looked at inside of the cells, and we carried on with Linnaeus' original work. Remember Linnaeus being a creationist, and we ended up coming up with this idea that possibly in the beginning we only had this, which then this was used by a larger bacteria to form its organelles, and the two worked together, and these went on in progression to form, if those two work together, then the cells, the individual cells, work together to form multicellular creatures, which were plants and animals and even the fungi. So basically we start with what God created to end up with this basic piece of information that supports the theory of evolution. Evolution just being a process, a description of what we see in the environment. Now, at no point, you may have noticed, have I attempted to take God from this picture, because there's simply no need. This is just a description of what we see. What drives it, what started it, what creates it, what makes it happen, that's up to you. I personally don't need to insert a God to explain any of this, but I'll leave that for you. Anyway, G-Man, final thing. Just ask.